présenter 3 éléments particuliers dans la pratique du comité. Alors, la première chose concerne les dérogations que certains États partis au pacte international relatif aux droits civils et politiques ont faites. Donc, vous savez sans doute qu'il y a 193 États partis au pacte international relatif aux droits civils et politiques. Donc, pratiquement tous les États membres des Nations Unies sont 173 États partis au pacte, donc pratiquement tous les États membres des Nations Unies. Et sur ces 173 États partis, il y a un très très petit nombre d'États qui ont, depuis mars 2020, envoyé leur notification de dérogation au pacte international relatif aux droits civils et politiques, comme l'exige normalement l'article 4 du pacte. Alors, je ne vais pas entrer dans les détails de cette liste d'États, mais quand je dis qu'il y a un petit nombre d'États, c'est que, si mes calculs sont bons, de mars 2020 jusqu'à aujourd'hui, il y a à peine 24-25 États qui ont notifié au secrétaire général des Nations Unies leur souhait de déroger au pacte. Et sur ces 24 États, en réalité, la plupart sont des États d'Amérique latine. Donc, on en reparlera sans doute avec la présentation de Pedro. La très, très grande majorité de ces 24 États sont des États d'Amérique latine, donc l'Équateur, le Paraguay, le Pérou, le Guatemala, la Colombie, la République dominicaine, le Chili, il y en a d'autres. Un très petit nombre d'États européens ont fait également une dérogation au pacte, mais ils l'ont très vite retirée. Je pense notamment à la Roumanie, à l'Estonie ou à Saint-Marin. Un très petit nombre aussi d'États africains. Si je ne me trompe pas, j'en ai relevé 4, le Togo, la Namibie, le Sénégal et l'Éthiopie, et auxquels s'ajoutent, pour d'autres régions du monde, la Palestine pour la région Moyen-Orient et la Thaïlande pour l'Asie. Donc, vous voyez que sur les 173 États partis au pacte, en réalité, cette pratique consistant à envoyer la notification de dérogation au pacte, finalement, a concerné et a été suivie par très peu d'États. Alors, pour ces États-là, les droits qui ont été le plus souvent mentionnés dans les décisions de dérogation, dans les notifications de dérogation, ce sont la liberté individuelle, protégée par l'article 9 du pacte sur les droits civils et politiques, évidemment la liberté de circulation, protégée par l'article 12, la liberté d'expression, article 19, bien entendu la liberté de manifestation, article 21, et auquel s'est ajouté parfois, pour certains États, le droit à la vie privée et familiale. On pourra rediscuter du pourquoi est-ce que les États ont émis une dérogation vis-à-vis de ce droit. Et il y a 1 ou 2 États qui ont également fait une dérogation relativement au droit au juge. Là encore, on pourra discuter du pourquoi de cette dérogation vis-à-vis de l'article 14 du pacte international relatif aux droits civils et politiques. Mais en réalité, pour les 24 États, les 3 dispositions du pacte qui reviennent souvent dans les notifications de dérogation, c'est liberté de circulation, article 12, liberté de manifestation, article 21, et parfois donc article 22 sur la liberté d'association. Alors, face à cette pratique des États, comment le Comité des droits de l'homme a réagi ? Évidemment, du fait de ses compétences, il ne peut pas réagir de manière particulièrement, je dirais, proactive. Donc, il y a 2 choses qu'a réalisé le Comité des droits de l'homme assez vite, je dirais. La première, c'est qu'en avril 2020, le comité a adopté une déclaration, ce qui est assez rare dans sa pratique, mais il a adopté une déclaration sur justement les dérogations dans cette période de pandémie. Et alors, dans sa déclaration, le comité, évidemment, n'a pas demandé aux États d'envoyer des dérogations au pacte, et je reviendrai peut-être si vous avez des questions sur ce point-là, mais simplement ce que le comité a fait, c'est qu'il a rappelé aux États les conditions à la fois procédurales et substantielles qu'un État doit respecter lorsqu'il décide de déroger au pacte international relatif aux droits civils et politiques. Par exemple, conditions de légalité. Il faut inscrire dans une base légale ces conditions, les conditions dans lesquelles on déroge aux droits de l'homme. Conditions de temporalité, évidemment, les mesures de dérogation doivent être le plus strictement possible limitées. On ne peut pas adopter un état d'urgence en disant finalement, il s'appliquera jusqu'à ce que le dernier cas de Covid soit réglé. Bien entendu, conditions de proportionnalité, nécessité. Ça, c'est évidemment très, très important et je pense qu'on en rediscutera. Et le comité a rappelé, là encore, bien évidemment, la non-discrimination, parce que ce que l'on voit en pratique, c'est que beaucoup de législations ou beaucoup de mesures adoptées dans le cadre de ce contexte ont un effet discriminatoire extrêmement important. Et alors, ce que fait le comité aussi, même s'il le fait pas toujours pour l'instant de manière très, très cohérente, je dois le reconnaître, mais c'est que dans le dialogue que l'on établit avec les États et dans la liste des questions que l'on est en train d'envoyer aux États pour ce dialogue, de plus en plus, on demande aux États partis au pacte d'indiquer quelles sont les mesures qui sont prises dans le cadre de ce contexte de pandémie pour lutter contre la pandémie, tout en respectant évidemment les droits de l'homme. La dernière chose que je voudrais dire en termes d'action du comité à titre d'introduction, c'est ce qu'il fait dans le cadre des pétitions individuelles, des communications individuelles, puisque le comité a aussi cette possibilité de recevoir des communications individuelles. Et là, en lien avec la situation et le contexte de pandémie, je mentionne simplement deux choses. La première, c'est que le Comité des droits de l'homme adopte de plus en plus de mesures provisoires. Par exemple, un petit peu comme la Cour interaméricaine ou la Commission interaméricaine l'ont fait, par exemple, pour protéger des personnes qui sont en détention et pour lesquelles soit les conditions de détention se sont singulièrement détériorées, soit du fait d'une maladie particulière, elles sont spécialement exposées au Covid-19, donc le comité peut prendre ce type de mesures. Il prend aussi des mesures provisoires, il adopte aussi des mesures provisoires dans des affaires d'éloignement du territoire, puisque évidemment, on ne peut pas éloigner du territoire un individu s'il y a un risque grave, avéré de danger pour sa vie ou sa santé. Et dernière chose, le comité reçoit aussi de plus en plus, je ne peux pas trop développer du point de vue des États parce que c'est confidentiel évidemment, mais le comité reçoit aussi de plus en plus de plaintes sur le fond, pas simplement sur les mesures provisoires, mais sur le fond, plaintes de la part d'individus concernant justement précisément les mesures que les États ont adoptées dans le cadre de cette période Covid ou de cette période d'urgence. Donc, elle commence à arriver. On commence à avoir un contentieux lié au Covid, lié aux mesures adoptées par les États. Et souvent, ce que les auteurs des plaintes mettent en avant, c'est qu'il n'y a pas d'épuisement des voies de recours internes possibles parce que justement, dans ce contexte d'urgence, souvent, les États ont soit mis de côté les garanties judiciaires, soit singulièrement restreint l'accès aux juges. Donc, les auteurs des plaintes viennent directement devant le comité des droits de l'homme. Donc là, évidemment, on verra dans les mois à venir comment le comité va réagir à ces plaintes individuelles. Voilà, Frans, je m'arrête là. Simplement, je voulais poser ce cadre-là en guise d'introduction pour le comité des droits de l'homme. Merci beaucoup et j'espère que vous m'avez correctement entendu.
Thank you very much, Professor Frans. It is indeed a great honor for me as an alumni of the Center for Human Rights to join this excellent platform for sharing experience of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. And I wish to thank you, Prof Frans, and the members who have organized this course for the kind invitation extended to me to speak on the experience of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. And I wish also to join Professor Hélène in also dedicating this to the memory of Professor Gustav Haynes. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights was having, I think it's the 27th or 28th extraordinary session in February 2020, when we started to receive reports of the novel coronavirus COVID-19 being reported on the African continent. So in February, as many of you would recall, there were only about perhaps half a dozen African states that reported the existence of COVID-19 cases, and very limited number of cases at that. But the Commission recognized for a number of reasons, among which was the fact that this is a new strain with a very deadly consequences. On the African continent, the health system leaves a lot to be desired. And in that context, rather than waiting until the spread of the virus and responding to its spread, the most legal and indeed expected way for responding on the continent was to take preventive measures. That was the way the Commission thought about it, and of course the recognition on the part of the Commission that the COVID-19 presents a very serious threat to a number of human rights, including the right to health, the right to life, the right to personal safety and security, among other things, and with very serious consequences to other human rights as well. So it was within that context that the Commission, by reference to Article 1 of the Charter, which actually is the provision of the Charter under which the states parties to the Advacned Charter bound themselves legally for purpose of ensuring the promotion, protection, and fulfillment of the rights and freedoms enshrined in the Advacned Charter. So since there is a specific commitment made by the states parties under Article 1 for taking relevant measures for giving effect to the rights under the Charter, the Commission issued a statement very early on, basically among the first African Union entities to initiate a response to COVID-19 pandemic on the 28th of February. And as you rightly mentioned, Prof Frans, the African Charter of Human and People's Rights is one of the unique features is the fact that it doesn't have any derogation clause. But the nature of the rights enshrined in the Charter and the obligation under Article 1 of the Charter is such that states have obligations to take all appropriate measures to safeguard the population under their jurisdiction from the threats that COVID-19 posed to a number of rights that I mentioned earlier on. But we also indicated that in doing so, that states have obligation to adopt a human rights-based approach to their to the measures that they were adopting, including particularly making reference to the principles of legality, the principles of proportionality, the principle of necessity, and indeed that of non-discrimination, among other principles, for example. Later on, when the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic became widespread across the continent, and indeed following the declaration by the World Health Organization of COVID-19 as a global pandemic, on the 24th of March, we issued another statement, which tried to provide a more comprehensive standard and also guideline to states parties. The idea at that point in time had to do with the fact that we have witnessed by March, we have witnessed the dramatic consequences that the COVID-19 response measures were having on rights. Yes, states were required to take measures, but the measures became some of them draconian, leading to very serious, more damage to rights than the damage that COVID-19 was causing. So we have witnessed during that period, for example, the death of more people as a result of excessive use of force by security forces than by contracting the virus. A very interesting report that was produced at the time was by the Nigeria National Human Rights Commission, which made this very interesting statistics about the number of people died as a result of excessive use of force in trying to enforce COVID-19 regulations, and the number of people died as a result of COVID. And that is one of the examples, but we have many other examples. It was within that context that we issued that statement. And since then, of course, the Commission had to completely change in the way the Commission was conducting its business as well, because the COVID-19 pandemic had given rise to and become perhaps the most pressing policy, governance, and human rights issue for all states across the continent, affecting all people across the continent. And then it has also affected the way institutions conduct their business, including our own. We have gone to a point where, although we announced it in February, the possibility of the Commission organizing its ordinary session end of April and March and May, we had to announce that we cancelled that planned meeting until we create the possibility of convening the session. But we recognized quickly that the pandemic was going to be around for quite some time, and the restrictions that the pandemic has triggered were also going to be in place far longer than we initially anticipated. So we have completely to change. And what we did was basically, let's move to the online, the virtual platform that we are communicating with now. And that's exactly what we did. But in between, you can see that, for example, the Commission has adopted between February and June 10 statements. Some of them general statements, other thematic, theme-specific statements, covering a wide range of issues relating to, for example, elections, economic and social cultural rights, protection of human rights defenders, freedom of expression and access to information, and the role of the media, the civic space, question of the civic space, the issues relating to prisons and conditions of detention, issues relating to policing and law enforcement, issues relating to the rights of indigenous peoples and other vulnerable groups are the issues that we have tried to cover. But we were not limited to these general and thematic engagements and statements. We addressed also specific country-specific issues within the context of COVID based on the reports that we have received. We also engaged, for example, in engaging joint statements from between the Commission and others. I can mention the example of the joint statement between myself and the High Commissioner for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in May, as well as the statement, the joint statement that we issued together with the African Anti-Corruption Board. Again, issues relating to the misuse of funds that were meant to be for responding to COVID-19 became a major issue. All of these culminated, of course, in Resolution 449, which became, if you like, this mega normative framework that the Commission adopted during its 66th ordinary session. That for the very first time in the history, in the 35 plus years history of the Commission, was held virtually. And also, perhaps for the very first time, that session had a particular focus on COVID and its implication for human and people's rights. So it was a very unique session that, in both of these respects. And it had helped us in terms of really bringing the voices of civil society organizations, national human rights institutions, and indeed the experiences from member states. And through that engagement to also address a wide range of human rights issues. And if you look at the press statement that we have issued at the end of that the press conference, that session, you can see the range of human rights issues that have been identified as a result of that engagement. And Resolution 449, of course, becomes the most important normative document for us to continue to engage both within the AU framework, but also individually with member states. And it's worth mentioning that it was welcomed by the Peace and Security Council when we had a meeting with the Peace and Security Council at the African Commission. It was also welcomed at the level of the Executive Council of the African Union, as well as an important basis for the COVID-19 response. I think in this respect, you can make reference to paragraph 2 of the resolution 449, because there in paragraph 2, you clearly see issues relating to law enforcement in particular, and the kinds of issues that have been, brought into certain themes that have been crafted in resolution 449 for purpose of law enforcement, whether that has to do with the use of force, or that has to do with mistreatment of people, whether that has to do with issues relating to the kinds of guidelines that is expected to be provided to law enforcement, and the relationship between the use of force for purpose of enforcing what is basically a health issue. For us at the African Commission, some of the responses that we have seen were very dramatic. Clearly, they have exposed the limitations of African states, particularly in terms of responding to events other than peace and security events. You see that the only response that African states are used to is basically the security response, even when the issue is not a security issue. That's why you see militaries being deployed. That's why you see some countries like Madagascar, for example, rolling out on the streets of Antananarivo tanks for purpose of enforcing COVID-19 regulations. And you wonder how on earth, tanks would be rolled out on the streets for enforcing COVID-19 measures, which is a health issue rather than a security issue. So those are the kinds of things that we have noted, also relating to prisons and conditions of prison. If you look at paragraph 4 of the resolution, highlighting those issues. And of course, the question of derogation that you mentioned, Professor Frans, no derogation clause, and the jurisprudence of the Commission has been that states can't use states of emergency as a justification for restricting or violating human rights. That's the jurisprudence of the Commission. If you look at, for example, Media Rights Agenda and Constitutional Rights Project versus Nigeria, you can see the pronouncement of the Commission in rejecting the use of states of emergency for restricting or violating human rights. And this has been a bone of contention, as all of you know, between the Commission and the legal fraternity and legal scholars, many, including, may he rest in peace, Professor Christoph Heinz, have been raising a number of questions relating to whether it is a good thing that the Commission adopted that approach on top of the absence of a derogation clause. And in this context, of course, there were instances in which states parties have challenged the position of the Commission, particularly saying, for example, that as far as the ICCPR is concerned, there is a clear provision, and we are basing our declaration of state of emergency and putting restrictions on that. And you have now a clash of, laws, if you think about it, or jurisdictions. So the issue, has become a major issue. And in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, you have a clear situation where the Commission is saying, actually, protecting rights necessitates the adoption of these extraordinary measures. That is what the Commission was saying. Without taking these extraordinary measures that have the consequence of restricting rights, people wouldn't be protected and their rights would be endangered. That was the position that the Commission took. And if you look at prior to that, the Commission also adopted a study under Resolution 332 on human rights in conflict situations. And in that study, the Commission indicated that perhaps there is a need for reflecting on the position of the Commission vis-a-vis states of emergencies and human rights. So the combination of this interest on the part of the Commission to address this issue as expressed in the study on human rights in conflict situations with the emergence of COVID-19 means that the best way to achieve the objectives of the Charter is not to say we are going to totally reject states of emergencies, but rather how and under what conditions, with what kinds of requirements would the Commission be able to actually engage on that issue, with a view for the Commission to have a legitimate expectation in terms of enforcing its voice. And the Commission ends up adopting Resolution 447, also in at the Security Organization, in which the Commission requested myself as the special rapport, as the focal person, to do two things. One is to report during the organization of the Commission on states of emergencies adopted by states parties, which I started doing during the 67th organization and also the 68th organization. But beyond and above that, I have also been asked to develop a guideline on upholding human and people's rights in situations of states of emergency or other extraordinary forms of declarations. So that is, basically where we are. And we are asking a number of questions in that respect. I will state those questions and I will end. What are the tests to be used or to be set for assessing compliance with the Charter standards when states of emergency are declared or other forms of extraordinary measures are adopted? The test. What are the principles to be outlined as part of this guideline? What is going to be the concept of derogation that the Commission is going to adopt, including in terms of, for example, the whole question of would there be a list of rights that would be classified as non-derogable, or how does the Commission go about, addressing that question of derogation? The question of applicability of derogation to economic, social, and cultural rights, and a very important area. The whole question of, for example, essential services. It is one of the questions that under COVID we have come to face. How do you go about other states in compliance with rights determine what we call essential services in order to ensure that it wouldn't be one that would have limitations, for example, in terms of the press. We have seen a lot of limitations in terms of the work of civil society organizations and NGOs, that some of which actually provide essential services. We have dramatic experiences of restrictions of their services leading to very dramatic consequences, including the loss of life. How about issues relating to timeline, oversight, accountability, the process of adoption of states of emergency or other forms of extraordinary measures? What are the processes that need to be complied with, or can any kind of declaration work? Role of non-state actors, role of independent institutions, role of Parliament, national human rights institutions, and questions relating to reporting to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights in case of declaration of state of emergency or other extraordinary measures. I would stop here. Thank you very much once again.
Let me see.
Hola, quisiera confirmar que me escuchan o que hay interpretación. Si alguien pudiera hacerme alguna señal, lo agradecería mucho. Yo le escucho, sí. Pero entonces espero o ¿cómo sería? Perfecto. I just switched into English channel because the interpreter told me that there are some issues that they need to solve. But I would start in English, and if there's any comment on the chat, I will go back to Spanish. So first of all, I would like to thank the no. I would like to thank the opportunity, and I think it's a very relevant topic for the study of human rights and in this specific context. And I would start by saying that I think there's a huge paradox, no? When we have a pandemic, which one of the main items or concerns is distancing people, and then we think about freedom of assembly, freedom of the protest, freedom of expression. Those are rights that we are used to understand them. We are used to live them, being with others. No, so I think that that's part of this huge paradox. So in the region that we are in charge of, I mean the Americas, I would like to highlight, I think, three factors that are relevant. And that I think are like the basis of the discussion. During the pandemic, we have a weak, and we have I would say an important damage to the rule of law. And why is this important? Because we cannot understand in our region the protection of human rights and freedoms without the basis of independence of power, without I mean the divisions of power and the respect from one power to another. So what we've seen is that most of the countries, and that's in part reasonable because of the pandemic, the executive branch asked for extra powers. No, they go to the articles in their own constitutions for exceptional times, and most of those articles consider that 3 months and another 3 months are enough for dealing with an extreme strange situation, and something that has been shown by this pandemic is that it could take longer. No, but I just want to highlight that most of the presidents and most of the governments call for these superpowers for exceptional situations. And then when we think about checks and balances, that extra powers are not balanced with, let's say, a parliament that is sessioning in a daily basis, or I mean, the parliamentary rhythm has slowed down. And that's important, and also the judiciary, the rhythm of the judiciary has changed in a way that is not the common one, and so we have extra powers in the executive branch, but we do not have checks and balances well developed for these times, and this happens in a region. And I will be focusing in Latin America, where the rule of law itself, before the pandemic, was very fragile. I mean, we're not talking about very strong institutions, just starting to be strong in most of the cases, and in other cases, with the rule of law completely dismantled. So that's a layer that puts an additional difficulty. Then when we think about the, let's say, the external helpers to the rule of law, no? those actors that are not internally in the state, but helps the democracy to hold and to discuss the pandemic, but also human rights. And I would like to focus in three elements. The first one is journalism and media. So before the pandemic, journalism was crossing through a crisis that got worse during the pandemic. And we are asking journalists and media outlets to do a lot of things that probably they are not able financially, editorially, politically, or even the human ability to cover some of the situations are not well yet. And also there's a lot of confusion, a lot of disinformation. This is the second topic that I think is relevant, because there's disinformation and there's confusion that could open several risks to human rights. And finally, the third item I would like to highlight in this external, things that goes around rule of law and human rights is propaganda. Something that I think could be interesting to discuss is that the pandemic is very challenging for governors, for public servants, because most of them, and if I were them, I would think the same, would like this pandemic to be they want to be treated as they expect to be treated as the people that did their best. And democracy also needs them to be tolerant to critics. So something that we are looking is that there's an increase of propaganda. Authorities that are sharing a lot of information. Some of that information could be accurate, but also the way that is presented could be closer to a big clap more than an openness to deliberation and controversy. And in other cases, we've seen that critics and journalism, for example, that it's criticizing the way some authorities are dealing with the pandemic. It's something that is being punished with institutional effort. So this criminalization, we have documented some cases of journalists that were facing criminal processes because of what it's clearly a fair and legitimate critique to how the authorities are dealing with the pandemic. So, and there's some kind of anxiety, in this, and there's some adjustment to the law frame, to the legal frame, in order to have more tools. Governments and authorities that would like to have more tools with the disinformation label, with the access to information, let's say, excuse for punishing critics. And I think that's something that we should be caring about. In this pandemic, and that's another paradox, we have lockdowns, quarantines, but nevertheless, 2020 has been a year with a lot of protests in the region. Even nowadays, my home country is facing a very difficult time. So, and that goes straight to something that it's an additional layer in our region, and it's informal workers and inequality and the economic impact. There's hunger on the streets, and I'm sad sharing this in this audience, because the science and the science findings advise that the people should be taking distance, but people is with hunger, and people has lost their jobs, or the way that they used to work is not the same as before. And where is the place where they are going to demand for those aspects of the life? The streets. So that's why, for example, in Peru, Colombia, Chile, even the United States, Guatemala, Mexico, we've seen that the public sphere, the physical public square, it's also relevant, even with the risk of increasing the number of the pandemics, because the people is aware of that is a risk to the health. no? But I would like to share let's say a phrase that I heard recently, and is, we're going to die for the COVID, or we're going to die for hunger, but I mean, die and death is close, no? And that's like something that it's hopeless, but I think should be seen also in a perspective of human rights. So, and also there's another, and this is not new, repression to protest. You know? How police agents, law enforcement agents are dealing with these protests. We are very worried about the situation in some countries, because protests that in most of the cases, in most of the countries, is a momentum. No, there's something before protest, and then there's something after the protest. It's becoming the status quo. No, for example, in Chile, we've seen that for years, protest and that demand, that claim, is on the streets and as part of the daily life. So if that is there, there's something that democracies need to discuss, even when there's this pandemic. Two couple of thoughts. I mean, because I don't want to keep this word, and I expected to do it in Spanish, and it's a little bit harder for me. This shift that I had to do. Digital sphere has become a very relevant scenario for exercising the right to free express, but also it's a way to be informed. No, it's a way to be disinformed, and that's the bad side of the coin. And it's a way to be poisoned by propaganda too. It's a way where some elections has become, I mean, the discussion has gone there. So and in that way, I just want to raise the hand and say that the digital aspect of exercising human rights now is more relevant than ever, but also the digital threats. No, I've seen as to the agenda of this cycle of discussions that you're hosting, and for example, surveillance and these apps that are being launched by also the government, but also private sector, where that data is going to, is it useful or not? Is it something that, I mean, privacy, I think it's going to be, even beyond the pandemic, is going to be an issue for Latin American countries. The way also governments and authorities are monitoring social media. No, it's something like some parameters of legitimate discourses that are labeled as good discourses, bad speech. It's something that is kind of weird for us. And finally, I would like to share a couple of things that have been done by the Commission. The Commission created a special coordination room for the COVID. Some resolutions of the Commission have been published, and recently there's one about vaccination process. No? And the Special Rapporteur office that I lead contributed to that resolution in two aspects. The first one is access to information. When we have superpower governments, that is something that needs to be that balance with transparency and access to information, but there's also a lack of transparency and access to information. No? And also we need to counter disinformation. Disinformation, it's something that is part of this pandemic, and hopefully this kind of discussions could also light the paths in which this phenomenon should be handled. So with that said, I want to thank this invitation, and I am more than open to keep this discussion with you. Thanks, Frans.
we just have a slight technical challenge that Professor Hélène has been added as an interpreter. So I think Dorcas is trying to reassign the channel that we'll hear her through. Yes, we can now hear you. You should now be able to.
We can see the screen. Here under the Spanish class, you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
fear we're having the same problem as we just had at the start, but now in reverse, where we can't hear Frans because he has become an interpreter. But I hope that most people can hear me when I'm speaking. So I'll perhaps just seize the floor again to repeat Frans's call if people want to make observations or comments or ask questions to do so in the chat. And then perhaps to pose a question myself to all of our panelists with having the African Commission's process of developing new guidance partly in mind, but I think as a more general reflection, building upon what Professor Aoláin just finished with about how we consider these emergency powers and the question of proportionality, which seems to me to apply to these powers, whether we are thinking of the proportionality of measures taken under derogation or the proportionality of powers asserted either in states that have the power to derogate but haven't done so under that regime, or in the African context where we're dealing with states that are operating under a system that doesn't formally have derogation. To what extent does the concept of proportionality offer a solution here for mechanisms to respond?
No.
Perhaps I could turn to the speakers in the order that they presented and turn to Professor Tigroudja first.
Merci. Merci beaucoup. Oui, alors j'allais justement réagir sur cette question de la proportionnalité. Je crois qu'il y a deux choses qui sont, à mon avis, importantes pour la Commission africaine à régler ou à prendre en compte. C'est à la fois la proportionnalité et la nécessité. Et comme Thomas le dit, nécessité et proportionnalité, je dirais, dans l'abstrait, c'est-à-dire par rapport aux mesures de dérogation qui sont décidées par l'État. Et dans le cadre ici du Covid, on se rend compte, je pense notamment à des mesures qui ont été décidées par certains États d'Amérique latine, par exemple le Honduras. On se rend compte que dès le départ, il y a un problème à la fois de nécessité et de proportionnalité avant même l'application, mais il y a un problème de nécessité et de proportionnalité dans le choix des mesures. Je prends juste un exemple qui a d'ailleurs été évoqué dans la dernière présentation, mais cette fois-ci pour le Honduras. Le Honduras a adopté une mesure d'urgence qui autorise l'usage de la force, y compris par les militaires, pour lutter contre la propagation de fausses informations. C'est manifestement disproportionné et il y a manifestement un problème de nécessité. Donc, je crois que déjà, la proportionnalité et la nécessité jouent à ce niveau-là. Après, évidemment, la proportionnalité et la nécessité jouent de manière beaucoup plus concrète au moment de l'appréciation, et c'est comme ça, par exemple, que la Cour européenne des droits de l'homme ou le Comité des droits de l'homme vont analyser au cas par cas si une mesure est conforme ou pas aux clauses de dérogation, mais est-ce que, par exemple, étendre les délais de garde à vue ou étendre les délais de détention d'une personne était, dans telle circonstance, proportionné à la menace de lutter contre le Covid. Donc, je crois que ce qui va être important dans les travaux de la Commission africaine, ça va être de travailler autour de cette proportionnalité et nécessité, mais je dirais dans ces deux étapes ou dans ces deux moments, à la fois dans le choix de l'État, des mesures qu'il va adopter pour déroger, et puis lors de la mise en œuvre, parce qu'effectivement, comme on l'a vu par exemple pour la France, autoriser des détentions sans plus aucun contrôle judiciaire dans le cadre du Covid, ben ça, c'est manifestement aussi, ça pose manifestement un problème de proportionnalité et de nécessité de la mesure.
Thank you very much, Hélène. I don't know, Solomon, do you want to respond? I realize it may make more sense for you to go last, but do you?
I can come last. That's fine.
Okay. I'll turn then to you, Pedro, if you can hear me.
Can you hear me? Okay. No, I think that's something that is before the pandemic, and that it's very complex to shaping human rights standards, is the difference between a controversy, between what is clear false information or disinformation, no? where is the place and who is the sender of those messages. I completely agree that, for example, when we see that there are people in power that is labeling what is a legitimate critic or a legitimate controversy as false information and is related with the pandemic, what is happening in a realistic perspective is that the public discussion is being undermined. So how do we categorize, and when we determine as human rights thinkers, if it is possible that category, the speech that is completely false, and when the label of false information is used as a way to weaponize and to undermine the public debate. I think that's a huge portion of the discussion nowadays. On the other hand, one of the things that worries us the most is it's the timing of this, of the overview that we do. No, things are moving really fast. The expectation, and I was listening very carefully to all of you, but I got very impressed with the emergency powers that seems to be like a permanent measure. No, what are we doing with the rule of law? What are we doing with checks and balances? Because it seems that the pandemic could become the perfect excuse to undermine through the rule of law that is needed for tackling the pandemic, but also to a common life between differences. No, that is something that we have the right to claim. And finally, talking about proportionality in our region, I would highlight two things. The first one is proportionality in the use of force for the protest. I think that's something that worries us a lot, because it's not proportionality in the legal measure, it's proportionality in the physical sphere, no, in the public square. And when we think about why the people is on the streets, they have reasons to be on the streets, and that's something that should be taken into account more than tackled and repressed. And the other side where proportionality comes to my mind is proportionality in the propaganda. I'm sorry to go back to this item, but the fight of ideas is not a controversy. It's not a deliberation process. It's authoritarianism growing up. And I think we have to. I know that it's hard to use this kind of words at the multilateral level, but the shadows and the steps of authoritarianism is there, no? And the pandemic is like giving a lot of tools and let's say arguments for being there. So when we see, for example, cases like Nicaragua, no, where we have a whole change of the legal frame that is completely in the path and in the interest of keeping the power of a very repressive institutional order. And that is happening not only within the pandemic or in the context of the pandemic, it is happening in an electoral year, which is very sensitive, no? Because the counterparts, the other options for the elections are being, I mean, this institutional change, no? I would also raise the hand for El Salvador that recently has had some specific changes in the institutional side. But at the end, what is the place and the right of people that are different to the people that is in power? Because people that is in power nowadays have more tools, and there is not clear if these exceptional powers or emergency powers are good enough to deal with the pandemic. Probably without those powers, the situation would be quite the same. But what it is sure, and that expectation, I think it's a seed of fear, is those emergency powers after the pandemic or within the pandemic. I mean, I think that we're very fragile nowadays.
Thank you very much, Pedro. And perhaps I could turn to Professor Aoláin to comment perhaps on whether she observes with a mandate that must look and think about states in both categories, as it were, any difference about how she evaluates powers that are being asserted at the moment during this crisis. I see that she's currently speaking into the Spanish channel. I'm not sure whether that will. Yes, that works. Thank you very much. Solomon, could I turn to you perhaps to reflect on how you kind of draw those three interventions together in your coming study and project?
Is it for me to continue, Thomas?
Yes.
Okay, great. So on the question of, I think, proportionality, certainly it would be, and indeed, if you look at from our engagement so far as well, is one of the principles that you can see coming as one of the constant points of reference, both in the Special Rapporteur's engagement and the whether country-specific or thematic-specific pronouncements in response to the various human rights issues that emerged during the pandemic, or in the more, all-encompassing resolution of the Commission. That it comes up with a specific reference to specific issues, as mentioned by Pedro, for example, with respect to use of force at one area. But I think in not just the actions, specific actions taken, but also in terms of even the law itself, that is the authority that is being asserted. In that respect as well, proportionality is at the core of it. But obviously it wouldn't solve everything and all the issues that have been raised as far as the human rights issues that COVID-19 related regulation measures have given rise to. That is one of the places from which we need to seek answers, but not the only place, obviously.
Thank you very much, Solomon. And I apologize that we've slightly overrun our time. I apologize to our panelists for the challenges that we've had in having you speak through different channels at different times. I particularly express my gratitude to Commissioner Villarreal for his indulgence in changing the language he was planning to present in. And thanks also to Professor Aoláin, who has had to leave us, but I think left us with some very productive and constructive thoughts about how we can mobilize the more kind of wholesale interventions in this space and not focus on particular cases. I also note that friend and colleague Anna Gudici has from UNODC has just also introduced a link in the chat highlighting some of the work that the UN Commission on Crime Prevention has been doing in this context, which I recommend to you all. But in the shoes of Professor Viljoen, who I'm not sure we will be able to hear from, I'd like to thank you all on behalf of the Centre for joining us. I think despite the technical challenges, we've had a series of really very interesting interventions from the different perspectives of two global human rights mechanisms and two regional mechanisms operating in different contexts, but facing many of the same challenges. And I hope that by exchanging with each other, we've given each other some ideas about the next steps. So thank you all. Thank you to our participants. I hope that it's been an interesting exchange for you as well. And I look forward to seeing you virtually in one of the future center events. So thank you all very much, and I wish you all a good afternoon or evening wherever in the world you are. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you.
Have a good day, afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.